New Zealanders are obsessed with investing in property, but how much does this 600k rental make in 2026? After hosting New Zealand's #1 property podcast, I've learned there are only 4 ways a property can make you money. And in this episode, we'll start by looking at what each of those 4 ways are. And once you learn how to figure out the returns for any property in the world, then we will finally know how much a normal rental property makes in 2026.
One of the big questions property investors have is how much money do properties actually make in today's market? Now, we've chosen this property, which is just over 600k. Talk to me about it.
So this one's Windsor Crescent in Spreydon in Christchurch. Is 5 units in total, ranging from $560,000 up to $620,000. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and the rent range is kind of expected around $520 to $550 per week. And so the yield works out to be somewhere between 4.6 and 5.2%. So pretty strong yield.
Now, if we're trying to figure out how much it's gonna make, like how do we go about doing that?
So there are 4 ways to make money in property. And the first is capital growth. So how much the property is going to go up in value over time. And so the second is cash flow, the rent minus any costs. Number 3 is instant equity. So have you bought the property really well under valuation, or have you renovated it and created some equity by doing that? Or have you done a subdivision? Have you added value in any way? And number 4 is debt repayment. So if you're paying down the mortgage over time, that's another way you can make money out of property.
And those effectively are the only 4 ways you can make money out of property. Now, within those categories, there might be lots of variations like an instant equity, and there are lots of different strategies for how you might pay down debt in different ways. But ultimately, every way you make money in property, at least as an investor, falls into one of those 4 categories. And so we've got to find a simple way to add those all up in order to figure out, well, how much money does a property potentially make, at least compared to the amount of money I put in. And that's actually the exact reason why we built Opus Plus. Now, this is our property investment software where you can put in any property in the country, or actually in the world, and run the numbers specifically in these 4 ways. In other words, the capital growth, the instant equity, the debt payments, the cash flow, all of those things. Now, if we think about capital gains though, how do you start to measure that?
So, okay, say you buy this property here for $620,000 and it goes up by, let's call it 5% a year. And that's pretty standard. You know, Spreydon's average growth rate historically is 6.22%. So after 15 years, which is our preferred method to kind of look at property investment over, that works out to basically the property doubling in value. Now, if we apply that maths, that property would be worth $1.2 million in 15 years' time. So again, that property is basically doubled in value in that time. So you've made $669,000 in capital growth, assuming that those forecastings are right. Now, before you get too excited, it's essential that we always think about money in today's value, because $669,000 in 15 years doesn't buy you the same amount of stuff as $669,000 today. And if we inflation adjust that number, it works out to be about $574,000 of today's purchasing power.
Yeah, I think it's very important. You know, sometimes you go onto like a KiwiSaver calculator and you say, okay, I'm really young. I'm 33 years old. So I'm not going to retire until like 32 years in the future. Well, if I put my KiwiSaver in and, and I put my money in consistently, wow, it's going to be like millions of dollars. And then you click the button that says inflation adjust and it brings it down to still a good amount of money. But once you take the inflation out,
not as good.
It's not quite as good. And so I think it's important that we're talking about like actual money, like the way we think of it today. But that's something that a lot of the media commentators often don't pick up. Even if you think about, I'm doing another video at the moment, and if you look at house prices compared to wages, did you know house prices are cheaper today than they were pre-COVID? Even though house prices are about 25% higher than they were pre-COVID,
wow,
wages are up 33%. So actually they've become more affordable. If we look at inflation, real house prices have fallen about 7% over the last 2 years. So it's very important that we factor in the fact that the cost of living goes up over time. Okay, so we know how much we could potentially make in terms of capital gains over time. Most people are going to be pretty comfortable about that. But what about cash flow?
So again, using the same example, we take a property worth $620,000 and the rent, we'll assume it's $565 a week, interest only mortgage. What's the interest rate today? Say 4.5%. And so over the course of a year, your cash flow would be roughly negative $12,000. So that's how much you need to top up the rent by to cover all your costs. And if you're factoring in all costs like maintenance, vacancy, property management, provisioning for your accountant, all of those costs. I think it's really important to always take into account all of those costs. If you're using Opus Plus, there's a bunch of assumptions it will use for you if you don't really know what to include. Because I'm seeing so much at the moment of developers or real estate agents talking about, properties costing very little to own. But what they'll be doing is they'll just be saying, you're putting in a 20% cash deposit and just factoring in the interest on the mortgage and the rent. And yeah, it might be neutrally geared at that point. But actually, if you think about the true cost of owning a property, there's so much more to it, like rates and insurance.
Well, even if we look at this example, the rent is more or less covering the interest costs even after you factor in the fact that you're not going to have a tenant all of the time. If we looked at this as if you had a tenant 100% of the time, then the rent would cover the interest costs. But actually, there are a whole bunch of other costs we've got to factor in, like your rates, your insurance, your maintenance, your property management. It's going to cost you money to pay your property manager to find you a tenant. We've got to factor in the fact that you will have an accountant, or a lot of property investors will have an accountant. So you want to factor those things in. The other thing you've really got to think about, especially when you're looking at somebody else's numbers, is whether they're using a cash deposit.
Yeah.
So a lot of real estate agents will do this when they're talking about investing in property online. But the issue is not everybody has a cash deposit. So let's say I come in here and we put in a 20% cash deposit. So rather than a $620,000 mortgage, your maths might be better than mine, Andrew, would be between about $124,000. So we'd be taking that down to $496,000. You're going to see that if you do have that in there, let me close that down, rather than having to top up that property by $12,000 a year, that would take that down to about $6,000 because you've got more cash in there. But most investors are going to be using the no cash needed method, where they're borrowing all of the money to put in it. So if that's the only scenario you look at, as if you had $124,000 worth of cash, well, that won't actually be the cash flow you would be paying.
And again, I think it's really important that you don't just look at the first year of anything. You always look at a longer term picture. So if you just if we just look at what the cash flow looks like over time, it's not uncommon if you're borrowing a lot or borrowing 100% using the no cash needed method, that you would expect to top up your property for a period of time. But then as you enter, so that could be, say, in this example, it might be the first kind of 7 or 8 years. And then for the next 7 or 8 years, it's positively geared. It's actually generating an income, which is bringing in some positive cash flow.
But obviously, if you put in a larger cash deposit, then you're going to have a smaller mortgage, which means you've got lower interest costs, which means that your property's cash flow is going to be better. It's going to be higher because your mortgage is lower. So a lot of it depends on how you're going to set that property up. But what you want to do in terms of the cash flow and thinking about how much your property makes is you want to add up all of the positive cash flow years. You want to add up all of the negative cash flow years and put them in, again, today's dollars. Because if you're making $10,000 a year in 15 years' time, that's not as valuable as if it was making $10,000 today, because we've got inflation adjusted all. So we'd add all of that up. Now, in this example, if you were using a cash deposit over those 15 years, and I tend to like to look at properties over a 15-year period, it would probably make you $31,000 worth of cash flow, but it would cost you about $33,000 worth of cash flow over that time. But then we've also got to be thinking about instant equity and debt payments.
So firstly, let's talk about debt repayments then while we're on the cash flow side of things. So if you are paying down your mortgage over time, that's going to mean you've got some more value later on. It's kind of like compulsory savings. Now, one thing that I would just point out that if you are going to pay down an investment property mortgage, you probably want to make sure that it's the most tax efficient way of doing it. So you've got to get rid of your personal mortgage first. But the second thing is it's really going to affect your cash flow. So if we use that same example, but we change that interest-only mortgage to principal and interest, we'll just use a standard 30-year term. What happens is the property becomes more costly from a week-to-week perspective because now you're not just paying the interest, but you are paying down some of that debt. So the mortgage is going down over time, but your cash flow is going to suffer as a result. Now, it's negatively geared for more like 13 years now rather than the 7 or 8 years that we had previously, but you're building up your equity in that property over time. So that's a benefit.
And that's where there is a trade-off between, in this case, how much money you're going to make through the cash flow and the debt repayments. But let's say you did pay it down over a 30-year term, then you'd be paying off about 137 grand worth of debt over those 15 years. And that is a type of return, even though you're going to make less money for the cash flow and it's going to cost you more in terms of that cash flow. But you weigh it all up. And one of the things that we sometimes get asked is about negatively geared properties, which is a property where the rent doesn't cover all of the costs that you're signed up for. And, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's kind of neither. It's just the reality of how you set up your investment property. For example, I was just reading on the Spin-Off. This is one of my favorite series. It's called The Cost of Being. And what they do is they ask people to answer a whole bunch of questions about how they spend money in their life and what life is really like for that person. And because it's quite difficult to see how people are really spending their money in their lives, I often find this is quite interesting. So in this person's situation, they own a rental property. The mortgage payment is $440 a week. She gets $430 a week in rent, which covers most of the mortgage payment. And then she pays the rest of the rates, the maintenance, and the salary.
Fairly normal.
Now, in this example, they've probably owned that property for a while. I think she bought it as her first home with a cash deposit. Now it's turned into a rental. But that's a little bit like the situation before where we said, hey, look, even if you borrowed all of the money to buy it, the rent covers all of the mortgage, you'd pay those extra costs. So that's just an example to show that, hey, quite a few New Zealanders actually do this. Not everyone. Like if you've owned a property for a very, very long time and the property's gone up in value, the rent's gone up, maybe the rent does cover all of those costs. But it's just to show you what's normal. But let's come to instant equity. So with this property, how much instant equity is there?
So there's none. So if you're buying a property at the agreed value or thereabouts, then there isn't any instant equity. It might be that you might get a deal, $10,000 under valuation, for example, just made up numbers. To be honest, I always say the value at the start is the purchase price. For instant equity, generally speaking, that's when you're doing something above and beyond. So you might be renovating the property, you might be subdividing the property, you might be buying it off a family member at a huge discount because they love you. That's some of the ways that I think there's some genuine value that you might want to count.
So if we look at that scenario where we've got a 20% cash deposit, we're paying down the principal and interest. If we look at the total returns, the capital gains we talked about $574,000 over 15 years in the scenario, we're going to be paying off about $137,000 worth of debt and making a small amount of cash flow. Now, the total returns out of that would be 713 grand. Now, if we look at the investments, okay, we've got to put in 132 grand worth of cash up front to buy the thing and set it all up. Then on top of that, because we're paying down debt, there'd be about 100 grand of top-ups you'd have to make in this scenario. Now, if we look at the 713 grand worth of returns versus the 233 grand worth of investment you'd have to put in, over 15 years, that'd be a 306% return on investment. Now, the one thing that I'd just mention is that if you are going to run your numbers on a property, we've got to do it in quite a robust way. Now, you don't have to use Opus Plus, which is our tool, but it'd be important that you've actually got a spreadsheet and running your numbers in a similar way, adding up all of the potential ways that you could make a return from a property, adding up all of the potential investments, and then comparing a couple of properties on a like-for-like basis so you can say, okay, well, which of the properties I'm looking at on my shortlist is potentially going to give me the best return?
I think the like-for-like is a really important thing as well. So sometimes I see people might have had a forecast put together by someone, probably not a financial advisor, for them, maybe just a developer, or maybe they've just done it themselves in a really basic format. And then we might go through the numbers and they look worse, but you want to put everything on an even keel and make sure you're comparing things with those similar assumptions or the same assumptions.
And then similarly, the other thing is, I had an investor the other day who said to me, Ed, I really want to see the numbers if Labor rolls back interest deductibility.
Oh, yeah.
And this property had no more interest deductibility. I said, I can give you those numbers, but if you want to look at that, just be prepared that it will make the numbers look much, much worse because you're going to have to pay an extra, in his example, about $10,000 worth of tax per year. Now, I can show you that, that's fine, but you'll just want to make sure that if you're comparing that to any other property, you don't want to look at a worst case scenario for one property and be comparing it to a medium case scenario for another property.
So now you know how to run the numbers on any property in the world, but before you start investing in property, you need to decide whether you want help to grow your portfolio and invest in the right properties. So make sure you watch this video next, where you'll learn whether property investors really need a financial advisor or not. Click the video on screen and I'll see you in there.